I still remember the day I walked into the bustling restaurant where I landed my first real job. The clattering of dishes, the sizzle of food on the grill, and the hum of voices filled the air. I was 24, fresh out of college, and eager to make my mark in the world. The smell of spices and fresh ingredients was intoxicating, and despite my nerves, I knew I was where I was meant to be. As a new waitress, I had a lot to learn about the fast-paced environment of the kitchen, but I was ready to dive in.
Among the flurry of activity, one person stood out: James, the head chef. He was 42, a seasoned professional with a reputation that commanded respect. His movements were precise, his demeanor calm even amid the chaos. There was something magnetic about the way he worked, a quiet confidence that drew me in. James wasn't the type to shout or lose his temper. Instead, he led with a presence that made everyone around him strive to do better. From my first day, James took me under his wing. He showed me the ropes, teaching me the ins and outs of the kitchen, guiding me through the intricacies of restaurant life. He answered my questions with patience, never making me feel foolish for not knowing something. Over time, I found myself looking forward to the moments when I could catch a few minutes of conversation with him during the quieter parts of our shifts. He was more than just a mentor, he became my anchor in a world that was both thrilling and intimidating. But it wasn't just his culinary skills or his knowledge of the restaurant that captivated me. There was something about James that was different from anyone I'd ever met. He was intelligent and kind, with a sharp wit that never felt mean-spirited. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, would meet mine across the kitchen, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people there. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke, with just the right mix of authority and warmth, drew me in. He had a way of making you feel seen, truly seen, and that was intoxicating. As time went on, our relationship deepened. It started with small gestures. He would make sure I had a cup of coffee before the dinner rush, we'd share a laugh over a joke that only the two of us seemed to find funny, and our conversations began to drift from work to more personal topics. He shared stories of his life, snippets of wisdom from his years in the kitchen, and even some of the challenges he'd faced along the way. I was fascinated by this man who seemed to have lived so many lives, each one more interesting than the last. And then there was his personal life. He spoke of his wife with affection, yet there was a distance, a formality, that suggested not all was well in their marriage. He never complained, never spoke ill of her, but the way he talked about their life together made it clear that the passion they once had was now a quiet companionship. It was the kind of relationship many would envy, a stable, dependable partnership, but I sensed that he longed for something more, something that perhaps had been lost over time. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, the nature of our relationship began to shift. The restaurant was nearly empty, the usual clamor replaced by the soft murmur of our voices as we closed up. We were both exhausted, our laughter more relaxed, more intimate. James leaned against the counter, his eyes catching mine in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "You've done well," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You've come a long way since you started." "Thanks to you," I replied, my heart beating a little faster under his gaze. He smiled, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made my breath catch in my throat. We stood in silence for a moment, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I could feel the tension, the shift in the atmosphere, as if we were both standing on the edge of something we weren't sure we should cross. And then, almost imperceptibly, the distance between us began to close. It wasn't planned, it wasn't something we had even consciously decided. But in that moment, it felt inevitable. His hand brushed against mine as we both reached for a stray menu, and neither of us pulled away. Instead, our hands lingered, our fingers entwining slowly as we looked at each other, the reality of what was happening dawning on us both. The first touch was electric, a jolt that sent shockwaves through my body. It was as if all the pent-up emotions, all the unspoken desires, had finally found a way out. I felt my resolve weaken, the logical part of my mind screaming at me to stop, but the pull was too strong. We were both adults, both aware of the implications, and yet in that moment, all I could think about was him, the way he made me feel, the way his presence consumed me. Before I knew it, we were kissing, a deep, passionate kiss that left me breathless. It was everything I had imagined and more, a culmination of months of longing, of tension that had finally found its release. But even as I lost myself in the moment, a part of me was acutely aware of what we were doing, of the line we were crossing. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I wanted him, desperately, completely, and for those few stolen moments, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. As we pulled away, reality came crashing back in. The room felt colder, the silence more oppressive, as the weight of what we had done settled over us. He looked at me, his expression a mix of desire and regret, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. What now? We shouldn't have, I began, but the words died in my throat as he placed a finger against my lips. I know, he whispered, his voice filled with a sorrow that matched my own. We both knew what this meant, the risks we were taking. He was married, and I was his subordinate. The consequences, if anyone found out, could be devastating for both of us. And yet, there was a part of me that didn't care. I wanted him, needed him, in a way that defied all logic and reason. But we both knew we couldn't continue. The whispers among the staff had already started, the knowing glances exchanged between colleagues. It didn't take long for the gossip to reach our ears, and the fear of being discovered forced us to take a step back. We began avoiding each other, keeping our interactions strictly professional, and the late nights at the restaurant became a thing of the past. It was painful, like ripping off a bandage that had barely begun to heal. The distance between us felt like a chasm, and every time I saw him, it hurt. I would catch his eye across the kitchen, and there would be that familiar spark, the unspoken connection that we had shared. But it was a connection that had to remain buried, a secret that could never be spoken aloud. 10 years have passed since those days, and yet I still think about him. I've worked in other restaurants, with other chefs and colleagues, and I've had other relationships, but nothing has ever quite compared to what I felt for James. It wasn't just a crush or an infatuation, it was something deeper, something that has stayed with me, even after all this time. I sometimes wonder what might have happened if I had been braver, if I had allowed myself to fully pursue what I wanted, consequences be damned. Would we have found a way to be together? Or would it have ended in disaster, leaving us both with nothing but regrets? And then there was his wife. She was always in the back of my mind, the unspoken barrier that I couldn't overcome. I had never met her, but I knew of her, and the thought of her was enough to hold me back. I was young, and the idea of going up against someone like her, someone older, wiser, with a history and a life with him, was too much for me to bear. I was intimidated by her, by the life they had built together, and it stopped me from going after what I truly wanted. Sometimes I imagine what my life would be like now if things had been different. If I had taken that risk, if we had allowed ourselves to explore what we had started. Would we be together now, a decade later, or would it have all ended in heartbreak? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left in the past, as painful as that might be. But I still think of him, and I still regret not going 100% for him. It's a regret that lingers, like a shadow that follows me through the years. I've moved on, but a part of me will always wonder what could have been. And that, I suppose, is the price we pay for the choices we make, the ones we act on, and the ones we don't.